police had everything they needed. The evidence was preserved. The reports were filed. The case stalled anyway. What they didn't have was the one test capable of turning stored proof into a clear answer. Investigators believed the case had reached its limits. The evidence had been collected properly. The witness statements were reviewed. A suspect profile existed. But it pointed to no one specific. There were no viable suspects who could be tied directly to the crime. The biological evidence did not match anyone in available databases. Tips came in, but none held up under scrutiny. As time passed, the same problem remained. The proof was real, but it had nowhere to go. Without a known individual to compare it to, the evidence could not move the investigation forward. Eventually, attention shifted to newer cases with fresher leads. The file was reviewed periodically, but no breakthroughs followed. What remained was a preserved record of what had happened, waiting for a method that did not yet exist. The case did not close. It simply stopped moving. But one detail never sat right. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't suspicious on its own. It was simply unresolved. The evidence did not go quiet when the investigation slowed. Years later, new material appeared that pointed back to the same offender. The wording was crude. The spelling was poor. The message was direct. Whoever wrote it knew details that had never been fully public. Then it happened again. And again. The communications were not random. They followed the same pattern, the same voice, the same intent. More importantly, they carried the same biological signature as the original crime. That was the problem. If the evidence truly belonged to a single person, then the case was not finished. It was incomplete. The offender had not disappeared. He had not confessed. He had not been identified. He had simply outpaced the tools available at the time. The proof kept confirming itself, but it could not point outward. It circled back to the same conclusion every time. The question was no longer whether the evidence was real. The question was why it still could not lead anywhere. If you're listening along, you can share where you're listening from. Now, here's what happened to April Tinsley. The victim was April Marie Tinsley, 8 years old, last seen in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1988. At the time, investigators focused on the theory of a local abduction by an unknown adult, which shaped the direction of the case for years. April lived with her family in a residential area of Fort Wayne. She was a second-grade student at Fairfield Elementary School and attended Faith United Methodist Church, where she sang in the children's choir. By available accounts, she was well known in her neighborhood and accustomed to playing nearby with other children. Her routines were ordinary for a child her age in that place and time. On Friday, the 1st of April 1988, which was Good Friday, April spent part of the afternoon playing with friends in her neighborhood. The weather that day was unsettled, and she had carried an umbrella earlier. After moving between houses with other children, she set off on her own to retrieve the umbrella she had left behind. That walk was short and familiar. It was the last confirmed activity before she disappeared. When April did not return home as expected, her family became concerned. As evening approached and she remained missing, her mother reported her disappearance to the Fort Wayne Police Department. Officers responded promptly and began treating the situation as an emergency involving a missing child. Search efforts started almost immediately. Police canvassed the neighborhood and surrounding areas. speaking with residents and attempting to reconstruct April's movements. As the hours passed, the search expanded. By the following days, hundreds of officers and volunteers were involved. The scale of the response reflected both the seriousness of the situation and the limited information available. During the early stages of the investigation, a witness came forward with a report that would influence the case for decades. The witness said they had seen a white adult male, believed to be in his 30s, forcing a young girl into a blue pickup truck. The girl was thought to be April, based on location and timing. This account led investigators to focus heavily on the possibility that April had been abducted by a stranger using a vehicle. On the 4th of April 1988, 3 days after April was last seen, her body was discovered by a jogger in a rural area west of Spencerville, Indiana, approximately 20 miles from Fort Wayne. She was found in a ditch alongside a road. The location was outside her immediate neighborhood and reinforced the belief that she had been transported by vehicle. Investigators processed the scene and recovered physical evidence from the surrounding area. One of April's shoes was found near the site, along with other items that were documented and collected. The distance between the recovery site and her neighborhood further shaped the investigation's early assumptions. An autopsy determined that April had been raped and strangled. The medical findings indicated she had been dead for at least 1 day before her body was discovered, and that she had been placed in the ditch several hours prior to discovery. These findings were critical in narrowing the timeline and understanding the sequence of events. In the days that followed, local radio stations established reward funds to encourage information from the public. Additional funds were raised to assist with burial expenses and support the family. April's memorial service was held on the 8th of April 1988 at Faith United Methodist Church, and she was laid to rest at Green Lawn Memorial Park. As the investigation continued, police explored multiple leads. An early suspect emerged when a 34-year-old man was charged with child molestation in an unrelated case. He was examined closely due to the timing and nature of those charges, but he was acquitted and later eliminated as a suspect in April's case. No physical evidence tied him to the crime. Investigators also released a composite sketch based on the witness description of the man seen with the blue pickup truck. Tips flooded in from the community. Many were well-intentioned, but none resulted in a suspect who could be conclusively linked to the crime. By the end of 1988, the direction of the case was largely set. Law enforcement believed the offender was a local or regional adult male who acted alone, abducted April during a brief window of opportunity, and then transported her to a rural area. This theory guided interviews, searches, and suspect evaluations for years. What investigators did not yet know was that the most important part of the case was already secured. Biological evidence collected during the initial investigation had been properly preserved. At the time, forensic testing could not extract the answers locked inside it. The technology simply was not there. The backstory of April Tinsley's case is not one of neglect or indifference. From the beginning, it was treated seriously and investigated thoroughly by the standards of the era. The problem was not effort. It was limitation. What followed in later years would show that the earliest work, done carefully and methodically, would eventually make resolution possible, long after the case had faded from active files and into storage. From the outset, the investigation into April Tinsley's murder followed the established procedures of the late 1982. Officers canvassed the area where she was last seen, interviewed neighbors, and attempted to reconstruct her movements during the afternoon she disappeared. Patrol units searched nearby streets, parks, and vacant lots. Detectives focused on establishing a clear timeline, hoping to identify a point where someone might have noticed an interaction that stood out. The witness report describing a man forcing a child into a blue pickup truck quickly became central to the investigation. This account shaped the working theory that April had been abducted by a stranger using a vehicle. Investigators sought to identify blue pickup trucks registered in the area and questioned individuals who matched the general description provided by the witness. Composite sketches were produced and distributed. These sketches generated numerous tips, but the information was often vague, inconsistent, or based on resemblance rather than evidence. In the months following the murder, detectives explored a range of suspects. Some were brought to attention by community members. Others emerged through unrelated criminal investigations involving offenses against children. Each potential suspect was evaluated based on opportunity, background, and proximity to April's neighborhood. However, none could be placed definitively at the scene, and none could be linked to the physical evidence. One of the early challenges investigators faced was the absence of eyewitnesses who could positively identify a suspect. The abduction occurred quickly, during daylight hours, in an area where people were accustomed to seeing children picked up by adults. The witness who reported the blue pickup truck did not initially recognize the encounter as a crime. By the time the report was made, crucial details such as license plate numbers, exact vehicle markings, or a clear facial description were unavailable. The physical evidence collected at the crime scene was carefully preserved. Biological material was recovered and stored according to procedures available at the time. In 1988, forensic DNA testing was still in its early stages. Law enforcement agencies could test biological samples only under limited conditions, and results often required comparison against known suspects. DNA databases, as they exist today, did not yet exist. In April 1988, investigators sent biological samples to a private laboratory for analysis. The results were inconclusive. This was not due to negligence or contamination, but to the technical limits of early DNA profiling. At that stage, DNA testing could not reliably identify a perpetrator without a direct comparison sample. As a result, the biological evidence, while recognized as important, could not yet deliver answers. As the investigation continued into the early 1990s, attention was periodically renewed. In May 1990, a message appeared on a barn in Street, Joseph Township, claiming responsibility for April's murder and referencing a detail known only to investigators. The message immediately raised alarm. Law enforcement treated it seriously, recognizing that it could be a hoax, but also understanding that it might represent communication from the actual offender. Investigators examined the barn and surrounding area. Crayons used to write the message were recovered, but no usable fingerprints were found. The writing itself offered little forensic value beyond confirming that the author knew non-public details. Behavioral analysts evaluated the language, spelling, and tone. While the message suggested taunting behavior, it did not point to a specific individual. For a period, investigators explored whether the barn message was connected to another child murder in Fort Wayne. A joint task force was formed to examine similarities between cases. Ultimately, the FBI's behavioral science unit determined that the crimes were not related. The barn message remained part of April's case, but it did not lead to an arrest. As years passed, the investigation entered a maintenance phase. Detectives reviewed the case file periodically, reassessed suspects, and followed up on tips as they arrived. Community involvement remained strong. In 1988, volunteers had formed a group called April to support efforts related to missing children. That sense of concern never fully faded, even as active investigative leads became scarce. In 2004, the case took an unexpected turn. Over a holiday weekend, several notes were discovered in Fort Wayne neighborhoods. These notes were left on bicycles or in mailboxes, addressed to families with young children. The messages claimed responsibility for April's murder and threatened future violence. Some of the notes were placed inside plastic bags containing used condoms and photographs. This development immediately revived the investigation. The items were collected and analyzed. Forensic testing confirmed that the biological material from the condoms matched the DNA profile recovered from April's case. This finding established that the same individual was responsible for the original murder and the later communications. Despite this confirmation, investigators faced the same fundamental obstacle. The DNA profile did not match any individual in state or national databases. The offender had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA submission. The evidence clearly pointed to one person, but that person remained unidentified. Law enforcement agencies increased patrols in affected neighborhoods and took steps to protect potential targets. Detectives worked to determine whether the notes could be traced through paper type, printing, or purchase locations. Polaroid photographs were examined, but they did not reveal identifying features. Once again, the evidence spoke clearly about behavior and intent, but not identity. In the following years, the case was reviewed by multiple agencies. In 2009, the FBI formally joined the investigation through its Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team. The case was described publicly as highly solvable, a reflection of the strong evidence preserved from the beginning. National media coverage brought renewed attention, and tips increased briefly. Still, no suspect could be definitively linked to the crime. Throughout this period, the investigation was constrained by the same limitation that had existed since 1988. DNA could exclude suspects, but it could not generate one. Without a database match or a confession, the evidence had reached the end of its utility under existing methods. Importantly, there is no indication that the case failed due to lack of effort. Detectives documented leads, preserved materials, and adapted their approach as new forensic options emerged. The challenge was structural, not procedural. The tools available were not capable of answering the question investigators needed answered. By the early 2010 seconds, advances in DNA analysis had improved accuracy but not scope. Traditional testing still relied on comparison to known individuals. The case remained open, but progress depended on a breakthrough that had not yet been widely applied in criminal investigations. What kept the investigation alive was the recognition that the evidence itself was sound. It had been properly collected. It had been properly stored. It consistently pointed back to the same unknown individual. Investigators understood that if a method could be developed to move from a DNA profile to a name without a prior arrest, the case could finally advance. Until that moment arrived, the file remained active in name but dormant in practice. The investigation had reached a standstill, not because the trail had gone cold, but because the road forward had not yet been built. Years later, advances in forensic science changed what was possible. Evidence once considered unusable could now be tested, re-examined, or compared against expanded databases. For most of the life of this case, investigators were trapped behind one hard rule of traditional DNA work. A DNA profile can exclude suspects. It can confirm a suspect, but it cannot create a suspect from nothing. To make an identification, police usually need a direct comparison, meaning the offender's DNA has to already exist in a law enforcement database, or investigators have to know who to test. In April Tinsley's case, the core biological evidence was real and it was preserved. By the 1992 and early 2000s, the testing could produce a stable profile. Later developments confirmed the same unknown male DNA was linked not only to the original crime, but also to taunting communications left years afterward. But for a long time, that profile did not produce a match through the standard system. The national database used in the United States for criminal DNA comparisons is built primarily from people who have been arrested or convicted for qualifying crimes, depending on state law. If the offender has never been required to submit DNA, then even a perfect profile can sit unmatched for decades. That is why this case waited. The breakthrough method that changed everything is called forensic genetic genealogy. It is not the same thing as ordinary forensic DNA testing, and it is not the same thing as the older familial DNA searches sometimes used within law enforcement databases. Here is the difference. Traditional forensic DNA profiling focuses on a set of markers often described as STRs, short tandem repeats. These markers are excellent for matching one sample to one person with high certainty, but they are not designed to map distant family relationships. Genetic genealogy uses a different kind of genetic data, typically SNPs. Single nucleotide polymorphisms. SNP data includes a far larger number of points across the genome and is the kind of data used by many consumer ancestry tests to identify relatives across multiple generations. So the method starts with a conversion step. Investigators take the preserved biological evidence and produce a SNP-style profile suitable for genealogical comparison. This is a specialized process that has to be done carefully because forensic samples are often small, degraded, or mixed. Once a usable SNP profile exists, it can be compared against large pools of volunteer genetic data, but only in databases that allow that kind of comparison. In this case, detectives worked with Parabon Nanolabs, a company known for both DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy support. Parabon describes the basic idea plainly. Compare an unknown DNA sample to databases that contain volunteer profiles. Identify relatives. Then use conventional genealogical research with records like census data and vital records to build family trees and narrow possibilities. That is the heart of the method. It does not give police a name instantly. It gives them a set of genetic relationships, sometimes distant, that can be turned into a family network. Before genetic genealogy produced a suspect, the case went through an earlier forensic step that helped keep pressure on the investigation: DNA phenotyping. In 2015, police released a Parabon snapshot composite, an image based on predictions from DNA about traits such as ancestry and likely appearance. They later released an updated version in 2016. Phenotyping can be helpful for public awareness, but it has a major limitation. It does not identify a person. It generates a probabilistic description. Even a strong prediction, like eye color or hair color, still leaves thousands of possible individuals. It is useful for direction, not for certainty. Genetic genealogy is different. It can narrow a search from thousands to a small set of people by working backward from shared DNA segments. Think of it like this. If you upload an unknown profile and the database returns a handful of partial matches, those matches are not the offender. They are genetic relatives of some degree. A match might be a second cousin, a third cousin, or even more distant. That sounds weak, but in genealogy terms it can be powerful, because it means there is a shared set of ancestors. The genealogist then builds family trees for each match, tracing lines upward to find the common ancestors, then back down through descendants. As those trees expand, a pattern begins to appear. Multiple matches start pointing toward the same family clusters, the same geographic areas, and the same ancestral couples. This is slow work. It is record work. Birth records, marriage records, obituaries, historical addresses, and public archives. The goal is to build a tree large enough that the unknown offender must be located somewhere inside it. Then comes the narrowing step that turns genealogy into an investigation. Once a family network is built, detectives apply non-genetic filters that come directly from the case. The offender is believed to be male. The offender has a plausible age range based on the year of the crime. The offender is likely to have lived or worked in the relevant area. Investigators also consider known behavioral facts from the crime and later communications. Each filter removes branches. Each removal increases focus. By 2018, this approach had already proven its power in other cases, most famously with the Golden State Killer investigation. And law enforcement agencies around the United States began applying the same logic to unsolved violent crimes. In April Tinsley's case, the timing matters. In May 2018, a Fort Wayne detective sent the suspect DNA sample for this kind of work through Parabon. Investigative genetic genealogy did not produce a single person immediately. It produced a narrowed field. According to reporting based on the probable cause affidavit and law enforcement statements, by early July, investigators had narrowed the likely identity to two brothers. That moment is where the method proves why it is so effective. Two brothers is not an arrest. Two brothers is not proof. But it is a short list that can be investigated with real-world police work. Now the case shifts back from databases to streets. Detectives did surveillance. They confirmed addresses and routines. They evaluated which of the two men could plausibly fit the timeline and circumstances. Then they moved to a step that is both ordinary and decisive in modern investigations, collecting discarded DNA. This does not mean a dramatic raid or a forced sample. In many cases, investigators retrieve items a suspect throws away. Items that contain biological material. That provides a legal, practical path to obtain a comparison sample without alerting the suspect or relying on consent. In this case, investigators collected items from John D. Miller's trash, including used condoms, and submitted them for testing. Here is the crucial point. Genetic genealogy is how police find the family network. But the final identification is typically confirmed using the traditional STR-style forensic comparison, the same kind of comparison that courts have relied on for years. The genealogy work points to a target. The STR match confirms whether that target's DNA is consistent with the offender profile. According to reporting that cites the probable cause affidavit, the DNA obtained from the discarded items was consistent with the DNA linked to the 1,000 988 evidence, and the 2004 materials. That is when possible becomes probable cause. Only after that confirmation did investigators approach Miller. When asked why he thought police wanted to talk to him, he responded with April Tinsley's name, and he later confessed. If you want to understand why this method feels like a switch flipping after decades of waiting, this is the answer. For 30 years, the evidence could only do one thing: sit there and say, it was the same person. Genetic genealogy gave investigators a way to translate that same evidence into relationships, then into a family tree, then into a small list of living individuals, and finally into a direct match. It turned DNA from a static record into a map. It also raised ethical questions that are now part of the broader conversation around this technique, especially when public genealogy databases are involved. Major reporting on the rise of genetic genealogy has noted both its investigative power and the privacy concerns that come with identifying people through relatives who chose to upload their DNA. But in terms of mechanics, the method that solved April Tinsley's case can be summarized in a clear sequence. Preserve the evidence. Develop a stable offender DNA profile. Convert the profile for genealogical comparison. Find distant relatives in a genealogy database. Build family trees using public records. Narrow candidates using case facts. Collect discarded DNA from the leading suspect. Confirm with traditional forensic testing. That is the test that changed everything. And after 30 years, it finally gave the evidence what it had never had before: a name. When the evidence was reprocessed, something unexpected appeared. It didn't confirm the original theory. It contradicted it. For years, the case had been shaped by the same limitation. Investigators had a DNA profile, but no one to match it to. The evidence could confirm, but it could not identify. That kept the investigation locked in place, even as technology improved. Then the approach changed. Instead of asking, whose DNA is this, in a law enforcement database, investigators asked a different question: whose family does this DNA belong to? In May 2018, a Fort Wayne detective sent the preserved DNA profile for advanced analysis through Parabon Nanolabs. The goal was not another sketch and not another database search in the traditional sense. It was a genealogical search, using the kind of genetic comparison designed to detect relatives across generations. The first result did not come back as a name. It came back as a set of connections. Partial matches, distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic material to prove a family relationship, but not enough to identify the offender directly. That is where the work intensified. Genealogists built family trees around those matches, using public records to trace lines of descent forward in time. Each new branch created more possibilities, but it also created structure. Over time, separate matches began to point toward the same family network. By the 2nd of July 2018, that network had tightened into something investigators had not had in 30 years: a narrow target. The work reduced the likely source of the DNA to 2 brothers who fit the case constraints, including age and ties to the area. That was the turning point. Because a 2-person list changes everything. At that point, the investigation moved from theory to confirmation. Detectives did what they could not do in earlier decades. They tested the hypothesis quickly, quietly, and directly. Investigators collected discarded biological material from one of the brothers, John D. Miller, from items in his trash, including used condoms, and sent it for comparison testing. The result was decisive. The DNA from the discarded items matched the offender profile linked to the 1,988 murder evidence and the later taunting materials. The case was no longer unknown male. It was a confirmed identification supported by forensic comparison. What made this breakthrough different was not luck. It was the way the same evidence was finally allowed to do a new job. For decades, the evidence could only answer one question. Does this sample match someone we already have? Now it was answering a different question. Who is this person? Even if we have never seen him before. By the time detectives approached Miller in mid-July, they were not hoping for a lead. They were acting on a verified match. When asked why he thought police wanted to speak with him, he responded with the victim's name, a detail reported in the probable cause affidavit and repeated by major outlets. The evidence had been stored for 30 years. But the moment it was reprocessed through a method built for family connection, it stopped being a file. It became a direction. The results led investigators to John D. Miller. For the first time in decades, the case moved forward. Miller was 59 years old and living in Grabble, Indiana. At the time the identification was made, after genetic genealogy narrowed the search to two brothers, investigators collected discarded biological material from Miller's trash. The DNA from those items was compared using standard forensic testing methods. The comparison was conclusive. The DNA matched the profile connected to the 1,988 murder and to the taunting materials left in later years. With that confirmation in place, detectives approached Miller at his residence on the 15th of July 2018 and asked him to come to the police station for an interview. He agreed. After being advised of his rights, investigators asked him why he believed police wanted to speak with him. According to court records and reporting, he responded with the victim's name. During the interview, Miller confessed. He admitted that he abducted April Tinsley in 1988, raped her, and strangled her to death in his trailer. He also admitted to leaving the later messages and materials that had kept the case active for years. Miller was arrested and formally charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. He initially entered a not guilty plea at a court hearing on the 19th of July 2018 and was held without bond. On the 7th of December 2018, Miller changed his plea to guilty. 2 weeks later, on the 21st of December 2018, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, consisting of 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation, to be served consecutively. Following sentencing, Miller was placed in the custody of the Indiana Department of Correction. His earliest possible release date was set decades into the future. In September 2025, Miller died of natural causes while still incarcerated. For the Tinsley family and the Fort Wayne community, the arrest and conviction marked the end of a case that had remained unresolved for 30 years. The identification was not the result of new witnesses or delayed confessions. It came from evidence that had been present from the beginning, finally given a method capable of unlocking it. This case wasn't solved because of luck. It was solved because someone chose to look again. From the start, the investigation preserved what mattered. Evidence was collected carefully. Records were maintained. What was missing was not effort or attention, but a tool that did not yet exist. For decades, the DNA could only confirm what investigators already suspected. It belonged to one person, It tied multiple events together, but it could not answer the most important question: who that person was. The lesson here is not about technology alone. It is about patience and discipline. The outcome depended on investigators who kept the case alive long enough for science to catch up. It depended on decisions made years earlier to preserve material properly, even when it could not be fully used at the time. This case also shows the value of restraint. No shortcuts were taken. The identification was confirmed through established forensic comparison before any arrest was made. The process moved forward only when the evidence supported it. Justice in this case did not arrive quickly. But it did arrive clearly. And when it did, it rested on the same foundation that had been there all along, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right way. Where are you listening from? And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next case where evidence finally gets a second look.